The point of no return in avoidant relationships doesn't arrive with shouting, blocking, or dramatic endings. It arrives in silence so ordinary that most people don't even recognize it while it's happening. It's the kind of shift you only understand in hindsight when you're replaying old conversations and suddenly realizing there was a moment where everything changed direction, even though nothing obvious seemed to happen. That's what makes it so unsettling, because you don't lose the person in one moment, you lose them in a slow emotional recalibration where their presence starts feeling slightly less reachable each day, even while they're still technically there. And if you've ever been in that space, you know the strange contradiction of it all, how someone can still reply, still exist in your life, but somehow feel further away than when they were physically absent. It starts almost invisibly, like a warmth in the room fading without you noticing the temperature dropped, and by the time you do notice it, you've already adjusted yourself to something colder. At first, nothing feels wrong in a way you can clearly name. In fact, it often feels like something rare and intense, almost like you've finally met someone who connects deeply but differently. There's momentum, emotional acceleration, and a sense that the bond is forming faster than usual, almost as if both people have skipped steps that normally take time. Conversations feel charged, attention feels focused, and even silence between messages feels meaningful instead of empty. But this early phase is where the illusion quietly forms, the illusion that intensity equals stability. Because what you don't yet see is that for one person, closeness is expanding comfort, while for the other, closeness is slowly beginning to register as pressure. And that difference doesn't show itself immediately. It hides inside consistency until inconsistency becomes the new pattern you start adjusting your expectations around without realizing it. Then comes the first withdrawal, and it never announces itself as a withdrawal. It arrives disguised as small things, replies that take slightly longer, energy that feels a little flatter, attention that doesn't quite land the same way it used to. Nothing dramatic enough to justify concern, nothing concrete enough to confront directly, just enough ambiguity to make you question your perception instead of the behavior. And that's where most people get pulled deeper into confusion, because instead of stepping back, they lean in harder. They start rereading messages, analyzing tone, searching for reasons that feel logical enough to explain what they're sensing emotionally. And in doing so, they unknowingly begin reshaping themselves around uncertainty, trying to stabilize something that is already starting to loosen on the other side. This is where the story subtly shifts, because instead of recognizing distance, the mind begins to negotiate with it. You start telling yourself stories that make the change feel temporary rather than directional. Maybe they're busy, maybe they're stressed, maybe they just need space right now. And while all of those explanations might feel reasonable on the surface, they also serve another function. You become the one maintaining emotional continuity while the other person slowly stops participating in it at the same level. That imbalance grows quietly. You begin initiating more, explaining more, trying to recreate the earlier rhythm that once felt effortless. But what you don't realize is that you're no longer responding to connection, you're responding to its absence. And underneath all of this, something even more important is happening inside the avoidant pattern itself. There is a shift that doesn't look like a decision but functions like one. A kind of internal emotional recalibration where closeness starts to register differently, not as safety but as demand, not as warmth but as pressure. This is often unconscious, not calculated, and that's what makes it so difficult to understand from the outside. Because from your perspective, nothing about the connection has changed in intention, but from theirs, something in their system has quietly begun to pull back. And once that pullback begins, even small moments of intimacy can start to feel like they require recovery time afterward, which gradually changes how they show up without them needing to consciously explain it. Eventually, this leads into a phase where space becomes the defining factor of the relationship. I need space doesn't just mean time apart, it becomes the first structural shift in emotional availability. What was once spontaneous becomes managed. What was once open becomes measured. And what was once fluid starts to feel segmented. This is the point where the relationship doesn't end, but it stops expanding. It starts orbiting instead of growing, circling around the same emotional distance, where one person keeps reaching for closeness and the other keeps stabilizing through separation. And the most confusing part is that neither side may fully recognize the new pattern forming in real time. It feels like adjustment, like adaptation, like something that can still be repaired with enough patience or understanding, when in reality it is already becoming the shape of what comes next. The moment space becomes the new rule of the relationship, something else begins to quietly take shape underneath it, and it usually starts with one simple instinct: the need to close the distance again. Not because anything clearly broke, but because the emotional silence feels heavier than the uncertainty that came before it. So you reach out a little more, you check in a little faster, you try to reintroduce the warmth that used to exist so naturally between you. But what often follows is not reconnection, but a subtle resistance that wasn't there before. Responses come, but they don't restore the same emotional rhythm. They land flatter, shorter, more controlled, as if every interaction now has to pass through an internal filter before it is allowed to fully exist. And without realizing it, a loop begins, one person reaching forward to restore closeness and the other unconsciously stepping back to restore equilibrium, creating a rhythm where effort itself becomes the very thing that increases distance instead of closing it. And this is how the chasing loop begins without either person consciously choosing it. From the outside, it might still look like a functioning connection, but internally it has already shifted into imbalance. One side starts analyzing timing, tone, and emotional availability like a system that needs decoding, while the other side begins to associate increased emotional presence with pressure they can't fully explain. The more one person tries to secure the bond through clarity, reassurance, or consistency, the more the other feels an internal need to retreat just enough to regain a sense of control over their own emotional space. It's not personal in the way it feels, it's structural. But when you're inside it, it feels deeply personal, like you are slowly being phased out of something you are still actively trying to hold together. And the most painful part is that effort doesn't feel rewarded anymore. It starts to feel misplaced, as if every attempt to reconnect arrives slightly too late to land where it used to. As this continues, communication itself begins to change shape. Conversations that once felt easy and natural start to feel unpredictable, like you're no longer speaking into something emotionally stable on the other end. You begin choosing words more carefully, not because you want to, but because you start to sense that emotional openness might not be received the same way it once was. And on the other side, the avoidant pattern begins to associate certain levels of emotional engagement with discomfort, even if nothing explicitly demanding is being said. So communication gradually becomes something managed rather than experienced. Messages are answered, but emotional depth becomes inconsistent. Silence becomes longer, not necessarily out of avoidance of you specifically, but out of avoidance of the internal weight that closeness now triggers. And without any formal declaration, the relationship begins to lose its emotional safety even while it still maintains its external form. What makes this stage especially disorienting is that emotional disconnection doesn't announce itself in a clean, obvious way. There is no single moment where someone says, "I am no longer emotionally present." Instead, it happens through accumulation, small gaps in responsiveness, slight reductions in emotional mirroring, a growing sense that your emotional experience is no longer being fully met where it used to be. You can still talk, still share, still interact, but something essential starts to feel absent, like a frequency that no longer syncs the way it once did. And yet, because there is still contact, the mind struggles to accept what the heart is already starting to feel. So you enter a strange in-between state where the relationship is still alive in behavior but already fading in emotional reality, and that contradiction keeps you holding on longer than the connection itself is actually holding you. This is also where the first silent goodbye begins, though it never looks like a goodbye at all. There is no ending conversation, no final closure, no moment where things are clearly defined. Instead, the withdrawal becomes internal first. The emotional investment begins to shift away before anything external changes, and by the time you sense the distance, the separation has already been emotionally rehearsed on one side. This is why it feels like you are trying to fix something that keeps slipping out of reach, because in a way you are responding to an attachment that has already started detaching itself quietly. And while you're still trying to restore what used to be there, the other side has already started adapting to the idea of not needing the same level of emotional proximity anymore, even if they haven't fully verbalized it yet. And still, hope doesn't disappear in this phase, it actually intensifies, because the absence of a clear ending creates space for interpretation, and interpretation almost always leans toward optimism when there is emotional investment involved. So you begin to tell yourself that this is temporary, that distance is just a phase, that things will eventually return to what they were once the external pressure eases. You replay earlier versions of the connection as evidence that the bond is still there underneath everything, as if memory alone can guarantee return. But what makes this stage so emotionally complex is that you are no longer responding to the relationship as it is, but to the relationship as it was. And in doing so, you continue investing in a version of the connection that no longer exists in the same way on both sides, even though it still feels real enough in your memory to keep you reaching for it. And this is where the emotional tension reaches a quieter but far more dangerous stage, because hope doesn't just linger here, it starts negotiating reality. You begin shrinking your expectations not because you want less, but because you're trying to stay connected to something that is giving you less to hold on to. The mind becomes incredibly adaptive in moments like this, rewriting what normal means so that inconsistency starts to feel like something you can emotionally survive instead of something you need to question. A delayed reply becomes understandable, a colder tone becomes excusable, a missed moment becomes forgettable, and slowly, without noticing it, you start building a version of emotional stability that depends on accepting less than what you originally needed, just to avoid losing the connection entirely. It doesn't feel like compromise in the moment, it feels like patience, like understanding, like maturity, but underneath it there is a quiet reshaping of self-worth happening, where you begin adjusting your emotional baseline downward just to keep the bond from collapsing completely. Meanwhile, on the other side of the dynamic, communication has already stopped feeling like a shared emotional space and started feeling like something that requires recovery afterward. Even neutral interactions can carry an internal weight that isn't visible to the other person. So instead of engaging more to fix distance, the instinct becomes to manage it, to keep things at a level that doesn't trigger that internal sense of overwhelm. This is where emotional availability becomes inconsistent in a way that can feel deeply confusing, because it is not always a rejection of the other person, it is often a withdrawal from the internal discomfort that closeness now activates. But the effect on the relationship is the same: less emotional presence, less depth, more surface-level exchanges that keep things technically alive but emotionally restrained. And what makes this especially painful for the other side is that there is still warmth in fragments, still moments that feel familiar, which keeps the hope alive just enough to prevent full detachment from your side. As this imbalance continues, the emotional center of the relationship starts to disappear, even though the structure of the relationship remains intact. You are still speaking, still interacting, still technically connected, but the feeling of mutual emotional participation begins to fade. And this is where the internal experience becomes harder to name, because there is no clear event that signals loss. Instead, there is a gradual reduction in emotional reciprocity, where your expressions begin to feel like they land in a space that no longer fully mirrors them back. You start noticing that you are the one carrying emotional continuity, remembering, reaching, initiating, maintaining the thread of connection, while the other side becomes increasingly reactive rather than participatory. And that shift creates a quiet kind of loneliness that is more disorienting than separation itself, because you are still with the person, but no longer emotionally met by them in the same way. This is the phase where the breaking point begins to form, even though nothing has officially broken yet. It often starts with a moment that looks small from the outside, an expectation not met, a conversation that feels heavier than usual, a need for clarity that lands at the wrong emotional timing, but internally it adds to everything that has already been accumulating. And instead of being processed as a single event, it gets absorbed into the larger pattern of distance that has been building for a while. On one side, it feels like another attempt to reconnect. On the other, it feels like additional emotional demand layered onto an already taxed system. And when those two interpretations collide, the relationship enters a fragile state where even ordinary moments can begin to carry disproportionate emotional weight, because the foundation underneath is no longer stable enough to absorb tension the way it used to. Eventually, this leads into what can only be described as shutdown mode, where emotional participation drops significantly, not always through absence but through containment. Replies still come, but they feel contained. Presence still exists, but it feels reduced. Emotional expression becomes minimal, carefully managed, almost as if the system has shifted into preservation rather than connection. And from the outside, this can feel like sudden coldness, even though internally it is often a gradual withdrawal that has been building over time. This is where the relationship starts to feel fundamentally different, because you are no longer interacting with emotional openness, you are interacting with emotional limitation. And once that threshold is crossed, trying harder no longer produces closeness in the way it once did. It produces more distance, because effort itself now triggers the very system that is trying to pull back. And somewhere inside this shift, without any formal declaration, the point of no return begins to form. It is not dramatic. It is not loud. It does not announce itself with final words or clear endings. It happens in the moment where emotional reconnection stops feeling like a natural possibility and starts feeling like something that requires more internal effort than the system is willing to offer anymore. It is the point where the emotional pathway that used to reconnect easily now feels blocked, not by choice in the conscious sense, but by a deeper internal resistance that no longer responds to the same signals. And from that moment onward, even genuine attempts to restore closeness can feel like they are arriving after the internal system has already changed its direction. And once that internal shift happens, something almost imperceptible changes in how effort is received. Not rejected loudly, not dismissed directly, but filtered through a system that no longer responds the same way it once did. Apologies still land, but they don't rebuild what they used to rebuild. Reassurance still arrives, but it doesn't settle the nervous system the way it once did. Even moments of clarity, where both sides try to reconnect with honesty, feel like they are hitting a surface that no longer absorbs them fully. This is where many people get trapped in repetition, believing that if they just phrase things better, try harder, or time it differently, the outcome will change. But the truth is, after this point, it is no longer about communication style or effort level. It is about emotional availability having already shifted beneath the surface, where words can still be exchanged, but emotional elasticity has already thinned out. What makes this stage so painful is the illusion of possibility that still exists inside it. Because nothing is officially over, the mind keeps scanning for entry points back into what used to feel natural. You remember earlier versions of connection and try to re-enter them through familiar behaviors, more patience, more understanding, more softness, more space. But the relationship no longer responds like it used to because the internal structure has changed. And so every attempt to restore closeness begins to feel like it arrives slightly off timing, slightly out of sync with where the emotional system currently is. From one side, it feels like consistency. From the other, it feels like pressure accumulating in a space that is already operating at its limit. And this mismatch creates a strange emotional loop where both people may believe they are still trying to save the connection, while the connection itself is already functioning under a completely different internal reality. And then comes the shift that is often only recognized in hindsight, the almost stranger effect. This is not a moment of anger, not a moment of betrayal, not even a moment of clear separation. It is a moment of emotional unfamiliarity. You look at the same person, interact with the same voice, receive the same responses, but something essential no longer translates the way it used to. There is a distance that cannot be bridged through familiarity alone anymore, because familiarity is no longer anchored in emotional continuity. Instead, it becomes memory-based rather than presence-based. And that is what makes it so unsettling. You are no longer experiencing the person in real time the way you once did. You are experiencing them through the remnants of what used to feel emotionally alive. The connection hasn't disappeared in structure, but it has faded in emotional immediacy, which makes every interaction feel like it belongs slightly to the past, even while it is happening in the present. At this point, the final pull away often begins, but rarely